So in this lecture, we'll introduce Confucius and his main principles. So this should build a foundation for a good understanding of the core of Confucius' teaching in economic management. Now, it's probably more convincing to learn about the greatness of Confucius from a Western scholar. George von der Gabelens, the German linguist and sinologist of the 19th century, had a remark on Confucius. And he said, if we were to measure the greatness of a historic personage, I can see only one standard applicable for this purpose: the effectiveness of that person's influence according to its dimensions, duration, and intensity. Now, he also said that if this standard be applied, Confucius was one of the greatest of men. For even at the present day, after the lapse of more than 2,000 years, the moral, social, and political life of about 1/3 of mankind continues to be under the full influence of his mind. It is true, since early Han Dynasty, which was 134 BC in China, Confucianism has become, the main guiding principle of personal cultivation, family management, state governance, and achieving world peace. And Confucius was regarded as the sagest teacher of all Chinese people. Now, one thing we need to understand is, and we'll come back to that later in this lecture series, is that Confucianism is a theory that spans from personal level all the way to international peace. It's not nationalism. So learning Confucianism is not just about the well-being of one person, one family, one country, but the whole world. Now, it is indeed difficult to imagine how can somebody come up with a concept of world economy and put that into practice 2,500 years ago. Well, to understand this, we must first have a grasp of the history of early China. So, let's have a look at the historic background. The Chinese history with written record dated back to almost 5,000 years ago. The first period was called the period of the three sovereigns. Now, it is said that Sui Ren Shi invented the use of fire. Fu Xi invented the characters and writings as we know today. The Chinese writing is essentially pictography, so it never changes no matter how the pronunciation changes through time. So that's why we can still read the writings produced 5,000 years ago. Also, Shen Nong created Chinese medical science and taught people about agriculture. So this period was followed by the period of the five kings. Now, it's rather difficult to determine the exact time of these ancient kings, but because writings were invented rather early, we're able to see a history record of these kings in many Confucian classics. The Xia Dynasty began with Emperor Yu. So Yu was granted the throne by Shun because of his superior virtue. Now, after 17 emperors, the Xia Dynasty was ended during the regime of Emperor Jie. We call him Xia Jie, in around 1600 BC. Now, Jie was a ruthless king. He indulged himself in an extravagant lifestyle and very brutal to the people. At the end of his regime, Shang Tang overthrew Jie's regime and ended Xia Dynasty with a war, and eventually established the Shang Dynasty. Now, Shang Tang was a great king. Now, he reduced tax, lifted the burden of the people, spread his influence through virtue, and constantly expanded the territory all the way to the head stream of Yellow River. But like the life cycle of any dynasty, it started with a benevolent king, and but when it ended, it is always because of lacking of morality of the king and social disorder. And that was the case of Shang Zhou. Okay, Shang Zhou was the last emperor of the Shang dynasty. So Shang Zhou was in fact a very clever and strong man. He was not an idiot. He made remarkable achievement in agricultural development. However, he was very cruel. According to a history record, King Zhou not only lived an extremely luxurious life, but killed loyal government officials, even his own uncle. So this eventually led to the military coup, and the regime was taken over by by King Wu. Okay, now King Wu established the Zhou dynasty. Now this Zhou is not the previous Zhou. It sounds the same, but it's a different word. Okay, so King Wu established the Zhou dynasty. Now, in commemory of his father Wen, so King Wu conferred him as King Wen. Okay, now King Wen is also regarded as one of the teachers of the great tradition, which led to the establishment of Confucianism. Now, as you can see probably from the screen, that the Zhou dynasty was the longest dynasty of the entire history of China. It lasted for around 800 years. And it was also the last dynasty that implemented feudalism. Now, in particular, the emperor divided land among his feudal lords, and the feudal lords divided land among their dependent families in a pecking order. Okay, in a pecking order. Now, the system was decentralized, and King Wen and King Wu influenced all subordinating feudal states with the highest standard of virtue. And they were called the sage's ruler. But over time, however, the familial relationships between the later Zhou king and the feudal lords diminished. And this decentralized system became strained. Peripheral territories developed local power and prestige that could compete with the Zhou family, the Zhou kings. Now, one of the later kings was called King You. Okay, so we can call him King You of Zhou, right? Who has always been used as one of the bad examples to warn future rulers about how personal misconduct could lead to their own demise. So after King You was killed in the middle of the coup, King Ping came to power and then moved the capital eastward to the city of which is called Luoyi. Okay, there's a city called Luoyi where they moved the capital to. So this marked the end of the Western Zhou. Okay, the Western Zhou, but also, of course, the beginning of what is called the Eastern Zhou dynasty. So Western Zhou, Eastern Zhou. Okay. Now, since moving the capital to the east, that's why it's called the Eastern Zhou, right? The Zhou royal family fell into you can call it a state of decline, and all the emperors of the Eastern Zhou line were, without real power. As a result, each feudal state was an independent nation. Each prince of each nation fought for its supremacy, and the power of the princes was greater than the power of the emperor. The Eastern Zhou was divided into two periods. Okay, the spring and autumn period and the warring state period. The name spring and autumn derives from the spring and autumn annals, which is a chronicle of the state of Lu, which is one of the states, okay, the state of Lu, between 770 BC and 476 BC. And during that period, more and more dukes and marquises obtained de facto regional autonomy, and they pretty much defy the king's ruling, which is remember the Zhou kings, right? And then they wage wars amongst themselves. So eventually the gradual partition of the state of Jing, right, one of the most powerful states, eventually marked the end of the spring and autumn period and the beginning of the warring states period. And it was not until 221 BC when the Chinese Empire was unified by Qing's state for the first time in history. Okay, so that marked the beginning of the Qing dynasty. Now here we have a map of the late spring and autumn period of China. Okay, and you can see that there are many different states, many smaller states in the country. Now, Confucius was born right in the middle of this chaotic era, we can say. He was born in the state of Lu, okay, one of the major independent states. His family name was Kong, and his given name was Qiu. Okay, so the Chinese would call him Kong Qiu. Now he's also known as Kong Fu Zi. Okay, where Fu Zi means master. Okay, so that's where Confucius come from. Okay, now whenever Chinese refers to the title Fu Zi, there is only one person. All right, only one person that this title refers to, and that is Confucius. So he is indeed, the teacher who shaped the philosophy of the Chinese for the next 2,500 years, even today. Now, in the entire history of China, Zhou Dynasty is marked as one of the most glorious and fruitful periods of cultural and philosophical development, which had profound influence over the Chinese world up to today. So, although the great mass of the people in Confucius' time was uneducated, but there was a middle class which had educated itself. Now, because also China had been civilized for so long a time, the people were naturally developed to some extent. So during the period of the Eastern Zhou dynasty, although the power of the imperial government declined, as I said before, the intellectual growth of the people actually increased. So the situation was the different independent states had acquired increasing importance, and the power of the emperor has been diminishing. So this gave rise to many peaceful diplomatic interactions as well as hostile military expeditions. And these forms of contact, if you like, had an educative influence upon a considerable class of the people. The society was in a mode of constant power shifting, and the political power was shifting from class to class and from person to person within each state. Some noble families had been ruined, and some common people had arisen. So as a result, the profession of learning was also shifted and more widely spread out. Now, also in this kind of struggle, everyone had absolute freedom of movement, and so it was a condition very favorable to the development of the minds of the people. And interestingly, that was the time in which Confucius was born.